music? China? What are they even saying? What is this Chinese rap music? Sounds like they're just saying ching chang chong.
My chance new girl watch made in China. We play ping pong ball made in China.
Hello and welcome to China Econ Talk, a SupChina powered podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Schneider. Given the trade war, it's high time we turn back to a time when a trade war turned into, well, a real war. The first Opium War from 1839 to 1842 was a clear turning point in Chinese history, exposing the weakness of the Qing dynasty and teaching foreigners that in relations with China, violence does pay. So how did this war come about, and what can we learn from its origins? Today's guest is Stephen Platt, professor at UMass Amherst. He's the author of a number of thoroughly well-researched and honestly highly entertaining books about Qing-era China. The two most recent being Autumn and the Heavenly Kingdom, an account of the Taiping Civil War, and today's topic, his new book, Imperial Twilight, the Opium War and the End of China's Last Golden Age. Steve, thanks so much for coming on China Econ Talk.
Thanks for having me, Jordan. Nice to be here.
So we were speaking a little earlier before the episode, and you mentioned that your engagement with China actually started after you graduated. Could you talk a little about your first few years in China and what that experience was like?
Oh, wow. Yeah, clearly the fact that I'm a Chinese historian today shows that my life course was somewhat changed by that. Yeah, I had never given China a single thought before my senior year of college, and I found out about a teaching program there. The Yale China program, and went off after graduation. I'd been an English major, went off to teach English at a middle school in Hunan province for 2 years.
Hold up. So what did your parents think about this?
All right, here we get into sort of the legacy thing. But the original plan, I think I had been planning to go to apply to law schools, actually. I saw this pamphlet about Yale China. You know, they'd been sending teachers to China since like 1904 or something like that. I was like, how do I explain to my parents that I'm going to head off to China? But I called home, talked to my dad. I said, there's this really nifty program and they teach you the language and pay for your airfare and set you up in China, et cetera, et cetera. And he sort of listened to it for a little bit and he said, I think Uncle Bob did that. And it turned out that his uncle, so my great uncle, Robert Platt, did Yale China at exactly the same site in Changsha, in Hunan, in 1915. So he was there for Yuan Shikai's attempted coronation. So there was a family connection there. So I got the blessings of my parents, and off I went.
Would you mind dating yourself here? So what was your first year in China?
I was there in 1993 to 1995. So I arrived just at the point of Mao Zedong's 100th anniversary, what would have been his 100th birthday. And those of you who have not been to Hunan, Hunan is Mao country. He was born and grew up outside of Changsha in a semi-rural area out there. So Changsha, the capital of Hunan, was just decked out for Mao. Everything was pictures of Mao, lighters that play The East is Red, calligraphy competitions to imitate him. Yeah, so that was the big news when I first got there. And like my first day in the class, like every new English teacher in China blows it on their first day. Mine was that there was a student in the back of the room who was sort of scribbling away at something during class, and I was like, "Oh, so what are you working on there?" And he said, "Oh, I'm writing an article for my school newspaper about how much I miss Chairman Mao." And I thought, this is a nice sort of English language teachable moment. And I said, well, actually, when you say that you miss something or somebody, it should be something that that you had or a person that you knew while they were alive. You can say that you long for him or something, but if you don't, if you didn't know him and you don't remember him, and he just stood up and started pounding his fist on the table and he said, "How dare you tell me not to miss my chairman?" And I learned my lesson from that. But yeah, so it was 2 years in the shadow of Mao Zedong, and just an amazing time in China in terms of transformations. I mean, I've been back to the site there, and I also had all the letters from my great uncle who was there in 1915. He had a much cushier life than I did. They had these beautiful Western style buildings, and they had crates of macaroni being shipped in for them to eat, and all they had tennis courts, things like that. We were in this sort of little cement building, which was the teacher's house at Yali Middle School. But this was sort of really one of the just transformative periods of China's rise, when some people were getting incredibly rich and most people were incredibly poor. And, just the boom of little businesses and things being sold in the marketplace, the booming resentment at the time of the people who, were lording it over everyone else and, flying around in their cars with special license plates. But it was a time when the students at the school were still very much being taught a socialist curriculum about, Lei Feng and caring for the peasants and working for the people. And everything they saw outside of the school was capitalism and getting rich and just going through that. And furthermore, these students, their parents were all the Cultural Revolution generation. So they had parents who mostly hadn't been to school themselves and couldn't really guide them through this. So a lot of them sort of come to the American teachers and ask us, what should we be doing? What should we be working for? What's the point of this all? So it was a very, very interesting time.
This period and a rather similar experience was captured really beautifully by Peter Hessler, I think.
Yeah, I mean, he was in sort of a village, his river town, whatnot. Whereas Changsha was a city of 3 million people. It was a backwater. It was considered a small city by China standards, but still, it was a huge metropolis. And I don't know, the last time I went back, you hear this cliche all the time about China, like, oh, if you go away and come back a year later, you won't recognize anything. And I've always thought of that as a cliche because I've always recognized things when I went back. And the last time I went back to Changsha a few years ago, like literally, I did not recognize it anymore. So much of the city had been torn down and rebuilt. And I was like, wow, okay, so this has really happened now. Like, this is just, I can't even like place where I am on the old map of the city. It had just grown so much. There were plans to build the world's tallest building outside Changsha, which
God bless Changsha.
Unimaginable. Yeah.
So when I was there a few weeks ago, and my distinct memory was walking along the river and all of a sudden running into a Red Bull sponsored skateboard tournament. Blaring Chinese and American hip hop. Probably not the scene you would run into back in 90, 94, 95. But just to show that there's plenty of internationalization going on in the heart of Hunan province.
I was still there in the era where some foreign teacher would discover that there was some store somewhere that sold Ritz crackers, and we would like all descend on the store and buy their entire stock and like bring it home and hoard it for the rest of the year. I mean, we were carrying cheese up from Hong Kong, all that kind of stuff that we tell the kids today who are going off to teach in China and they can't understand it. Old man.
So you transitioned from being an English major to a focus on a PhD in late Qing dynasty history. So what brought you to history in this era in particular?
These are both great questions. In terms of history as a discipline, I'd run my course with English. I actually started English grad school when I came back from China and then dropped out. The thing that I loved about being an English major was reading, and and reading great works of literature. And once it got to just sort of pure analysis and theory and stuff, then I got bored. History, I hadn't really studied at all. I took the required courses in high school. I took one course as an undergrad, and really, I started reading Jonathan Spence's works when I was in Changsha and had tons of reading time on my hands. And it was the sort of the joy of reading something that read like literature but was real and was teaching you something about the past. And just the fact that you can do this. And as an English major, I'd sort of always dreamed of being a writer, but I knew I didn't really have it in me. Whereas being a historian, you don't have to make things up, which is the hard part about being a novelist. You don't have to invent characters and think about how to make them consistent. That you're writing about people who lived at a certain time, and there are sources on them that help you flesh them out. So everything is, if you dig deep enough, enough is there for you to write history in a narrative form, with characters running around here and there, without any of the sort of running, hitting the wall like you do when you're trying to write a short story and have no idea what happens next. My wife writes fiction, and I'm always saying how lucky she is that if she that she gets to just make stuff up, and then she tells me, well, every if you don't know what's going to happen next, you don't get writer's block. You just go to the library and find out what happened.
That makes a lot of sense. I had a pretty similar experience spending a few months in Guilin last summer doing nothing but studying Chinese and reading Jonathan Spence's books. So is there any one book in particular that stuck to you over these years that you've kept coming back to of Jonathan Spence's?
Wow, they all sort of blend into each other. But I do remember starting God's Chinese Son, Jonathan Spence's Taiping book, and just being just blown away that this wasn't like any history book that I had read before. I mean, he writes it sort of in the he writes it in the present tense. It sort of is very immediate and literary, and yeah, just as a way of just sort of bringing this world to life. I hadn't really seen anything like it before. I mean, he's the reason I became a historian. After I dropped out of English grad school, I went and worked in New York for a little while, started applying to other kinds of grad school, East Asian studies and whatnot, and wound up going to Yale for a PhD in history with Jonathan Spence. And if he hadn't taken me and sort of encouraged me, I don't know if I would have become a historian. I mean, he was sort of the historian that I wanted to study with. I would have been just as happy going into like poli-sci or Chinese literature or some other field. With a different scholar. So it was almost accidental in the end that I wound up becoming a historian of China. You asked about the Qing dynasty, like why the Qing, and it's really the 19th century and the early 20th century that I'm most interested in. Partly because those are the eras where the engagement with the West matters so much, and I think as a foreigner studying the history of China, the things that have interested me are things that resonated with my own experience of being a foreigner in China. And so I'm very much interested in the characters of various foreigners who came to China and attempted to do different things. I'm very much interested in sort of Chinese who write about how to deal with foreigners or in foreign countries. I should say though that all this stuff is sort of just one thing leads to another. There's no master plan. But the way I got into the Qing dynasty specifically, was my dissertation in grad school was on reformers and revolutionaries in Hunan province. And I became interested in them because I had lived in Hunan and I loved this province that I'd lived in, and it was always sort of looked down on as this backwater. And as I was, reading around looking for topics to do research on, I was just amazed at how incredibly prominent the Hunanese were in the late 19th century. Really starting with the Taiping Rebellion, which is suppressed by Zheng Guofan, the great Hunanese general, leads into this forgotten golden age for Hunan, where there's one point where most of the governor generals in the empire are Hunanese, and other provinces are saying that they're being colonized by the Hunanese. Most of many of the leading reformers and then later the leading revolutionaries were all coming out of this same sort of ferment in this supposedly backwater province. And the book sort of culminated with the around 1920. When Mao Zedong, good old Mao, always there somewhere, was leading a Hunan independence movement. This is prior to becoming a communist, that he was trying to, he was arguing for a Hunanese nation to establish itself as a republic. One of the lingering questions I had from that project was, well, why did the Hunan army win? Why was Zheng Guofan such an amazing general? What was it that he did? He's this fascinating figure, this Confucian scholar who kind of gets dragged into warfare with no experience, and ends up as one of the greatest generals of China's modern history. I could only touch on him in a few pages in the dissertation in my first book. So the Taiping book that I wrote really began as wanting to find out more about Zheng Guofan, and then it expanded from there to include the foreigners who were taking sides in the war, and then it got bigger and bigger. And then this Opium War book, again, it's about British-American-Chinese relations in an extremely formative era, which is a topic that I just find endlessly fascinating.
It's really interesting contrasting the Taiping Tianguo book to your Opium War one, in that the first work is a real blow-by-blow of the war, while this Opium War book is almost a 50-year diplomatic history of the lead-up and spends very little time on the war itself. So what accounts for the difference in the focus between these two?
Oh, that's a really good question. Because some of that comes down to just the practicalities of being a historian, and you're embarking on a project that's going to take years of research and writing before it can result in a book. And when the book comes out, you hope that there isn't another book just like it that is already on the shelves, every historian is going to write about the same events in different ways. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of books on on the US Civil War that come out every year, and nobody seems to be complaining about that. In the Chinese studies field, people complain about that. And actually, when I started working on the typing, I had several people tell me, well, don't you know Jonathan Spence already wrote a book about the Taiping Rebellion? And I just wanted to throttle them. There's this sort of this narrowness sometimes that comes in, or this belief that that people write these definitive books and then nobody else writes about it forever. I think graduate students are scared away from doing really big topics because there's already a book on that. And so they're encouraged to do something sort of more narrow and focused that just hasn't been done before. And, there's no better recipe for being bored with your work if you're only doing it because it hasn't been done. So, ideally you want to find a topic that you love that also is a new take on something. But inevitably you wind up sort of bouncing off of the books that do exist already. So when I was starting to work on the typing book, of course I was aware that Jonathan Spence had written a book on the Taiping. But his book was very much about the origins of the Taiping Rebellion, and it was very much a biography of Hong Xiuquan, the leader. And if you look at my book my particular book, I went a completely different direction. There's very, very little about Hong Xiuquan in there, and there's very, very little about the origins of the Taiping. What I wrote about, since it hadn't been written about in any major way, was sort of the conduct of the war itself. And with my interest in Zhengguofan and my interest in foreign relations, the period that really loomed largest was the last 4 years or so of the war, which is the period where Zhengguofan begins to matter. I mean, he doesn't even get to come in until maybe chapter 7 or 8 in the book, about a third of the way through. So it's where Zhengguofan and the Hunanese start to matter in this war, and it's where the foreigners start to really matter in the war. And so then I had sort of a territory to work with that I didn't have a model for, and that's the real joy of working, sort of the freedom to follow the parts of the topic that you want. But hundreds of people could come along and write books about that exact same era of the war, and they would all be able to find something different and new sources and new angles on it. And there should be the same kind of vibrancy that we expect of like U.S. Civil War history, but we haven't gotten there yet. So in terms of bouncing off, the Opium War book, which I guess is what I'm supposed to be talking about here today, when you're starting a new project, there's sort of these twin tensions. One being the inertia of essentially trying to write a book that's like the book that you previously wrote, because you're sort of in that mode of narrative writing. And so initially I wanted to write about the Opium War, and I was like, oh, well, I can just write a book about the Opium War and how it was fought and how the armies moved around and the ships and things like that. And because that was how I had written a lot of the typing book. But then Julia Lovell was just at that point publishing a book which was a narrative history of the Opium War, sort of beginning to end, how the battles were fought, where the ships went, who was fighting on either side. So I looked at that, and she did a good job with that, and I was like, well, I don't need to really go over the same turf. So what is it that really interests me about this topic, and what is it where I think I can really sort of like dig my shovel into some newer ground? And really, it was the question of why it ever happened in the first place that drove my book. And that started taking me back and back and back and back, and it wound up being a very different book from the typing book, in that the typing book basically took place all in the space of about 4 or 5 years. The Opium War book wound up covering something like 50 years. And back to what I was saying about the sort of the twin tensions of starting a new project. On the one hand, you have the inertia of wanting to continue in the same vein with similar kinds of sources, similar kind of narrative, because that's an easier transition. On the other hand, there's a part of you that wants to do something totally different. And so the research for the Opium War book and the writing of it were completely different. And I'm glad you said you liked it. When I was writing it, it's a very different kind of a story to tell, because it takes place over such a long period of time. And for one thing, the characters in the Opium War book come and go fairly quickly. Nobody sticks around for long. There's only a few that are in there for any really extended period of the book, compared to writing about events that took place over the course of 4 years, where your characters are all in play through the entire book unless they get killed. So there's something sort of tighter and easier to write about something like the Taiping Rebellion. Whereas working with this book, I don't know, I'm trying to think back to my English major days. Is it a picaresque where you're sort of going and this thing happens and that thing happens and this thing over here happens, and then you try to connect them all together? But it's more of that stories come and go, events come and go, characters come and go, and you try to sort of thread it all together so it makes sense as a whole.
Could you lay out the traditional historiography of the Opium War in the West and what brought you to question that narrative?
Yeah, I mean, and the main thing that I was grappling with here, because I was writing a book for a general audience, for general readers, one that will be readable to scholars, but ultimately the not the straw man, but the sort of the versions of Opium War history that I really wanted to tackle are the ones more in the popular imagination, or the ones that stick in books that are often assigned for freshman classes in college or read by people who are just interested in history. Which is to say that that scholars have been chipping away from all different directions at the Opium War. There's an ocean of scholarship on the Opium War, but most of it lives exclusively in the scholarly realm. And so the more general public understandings of the Opium War, as it appears sort of in Britain, it seems to have been mostly forgotten, except for Julia Lovell's book recently. As it's generally understood by people who learn about it, of course, the British, forced opium on the Chinese and went to war in order to open the ports because that's what the British did. So there's basically that sense of things, that this is, yet another of Britain's, imperial crimes, this horrible chapter of history, and completely predictable because that's what the British were like. Okay, and that falls apart on closer inspection, especially looking at the critics of the war, the political opposition to the war in Britain, that no, the British were not universally gung-ho about forcing their will on everybody in sight. There's another version of it which shows up in a lot of the older English language books on the Opium War, which still get read and still get assigned, which is this sort of genteel wink, wink, nudge, nudge. This is the story, triumph of the West. And, here are the British teaching a lesson to these, arrogant Chinese who dare to call the British barbarians. And there's sort of this smugness that surrounds some of these books as well. And in books like that, the Chinese characters always appear as these sort of long fingernailed mandarins stuck in the past, unable to speak complete sentences and disparaging everything around them while being completely oblivious to the outside world. That also is a complete crock when you go back and look at the era. That there were very sophisticated arguments about by Chinese scholars about how to handle foreign relations, how to deal with a British military threat. The Chinese were not at all ignorant of Britain's military power. The emperor he was all the way up in Beijing, but coastal officials, they'd been on British Navy ships, they'd seen them in action. They knew that this was a war that China should not enter and should not provoke. And and the basic smugness has to go out the window also, because this was a terrible, immoral war. And one of my fundamental questions here was, how did a society that at the time considered itself moral, Britain had just abolished slavery a few years earlier and held itself up as this moral example for the world, how did it go from banning slavery and then suddenly turning around and fighting a war on behalf of drug dealers, which was essentially what this war was? So it seemed really paradoxical, and that's what I wanted to try to unravel, is how this actually happened against, in light of the moral thought of the time and in light of the criticism that it received. And I guess the last thing I would say about sort of general understandings of the Opium War is that, as understood in China, the Opium War is the predictable outcome of essentially a British imperial master plan, that the British had always been sharpening their knives and dreaming of carving up China and taking its riches. And here is where they finally got around to doing it. But in that, yet again falls apart on closer inspection, that there was nothing premeditated about this war. When you go back and you look at the era itself, the British government was actually remarkably consistent in avoiding any kind of violence towards China, avoiding conflict with them because they feared losing their tea trade. And periodically you would have British traders on the ground who try to gin up some excuse to send in gunships. And one after the other, they're shot down. They're shot down by the East India Company. They're shot down by Parliament. They're shot down by the Foreign Secretary. And even Lord Palmerston, the foreign secretary that launches the Opium War and prosecutes it, less than a year before the war broke out, he had issued clear instructions to his agent on the ground that any British subjects in China who should be punished for breaking the law, meaning smuggling opium, had to suffer their own consequences. And it was their responsibility for having chosen to violate the laws of China. And the British government would not help them. And then lo and behold, a year later, suddenly the British government is helping them.
Whew, okay, that's a lot to unpack. So let's start by walking through the main themes and start with this misconception of the first British mission to the Emperor of China. So a cute note, the British king writing a letter to the Qianlong Emperor was trying to get into the head of what he expected this wizened Oriental emperor would want to hear, so came up with this great phraseology saying stuff like Supreme Emperor of China, worthy to live tens and tens of thousands of years. Now, God knows if that would be something that South Korea or Vietnam would send China's way. But anyways, what struck out most to me about the beginning of the book was the general narrative of Macartney's visit is how the Chinese aren't really interested in all at the British goods and their scientific advances. So what actually was the response of the emperor to this delegation?
All right, so so Macartney comes to the court of Qianlong just in absolute awe of China, of its power, of its wealth, of its unity, and this is a classic moment because he doesn't get anything he wants, and then he goes away grumbling about how the whole place is going to collapse any day now, and it's this terrible country with a horrible leader. So you have the sort of the disgruntlement of the British hoping for trade advantages, but one of the things that becomes sort of eternalized from this is this notion that that China didn't care about foreign trade at all, and that it didn't care about foreigners, and it didn't blah blah blah. And there's this famous edict that the Qianlong Emperor addressed to the King of England, which is used in every China survey course. It should be used in every China survey course, where he says we have no need for your manufacturers. We possess all things, and da 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 da. It's always interpreted for some reason as, and I guess because of the British at the time interpreted it that way, as being as essentially boiling down to, we don't care about the things that you have. We don't care about the things that come through trade with the British. China is self-sufficient and doesn't need anything from beyond its own borders. That's not actually what that edict says. In the context of the edict itself, what Qianlong is basically saying is we don't need more foreign trade than we already have. We are content with the way things work now. And when he says we possess all things, that's in the context of saying that foreigners have already come from all corners of the world to bring us their various manufacturers. We've seen all these things before. There's nothing that's new to us. So essentially there's this cosmopolitanism in there where they're already familiar with all of these products that the British are trying to awe them with. And they can get them through Canton. And the emperor himself had a huge collection of English clocks. He had written poems about English products like glass. He was very keenly interested himself. He had kept a European court painter to do oil paintings of him. So in the kerfuffle around this failed embassy, we get this long-lasting myth that up until the Opium War, nobody in China had any concern about the outside world, which is just wrong. There was a thriving trade at Canton, which was very important for the Chinese economy as a source of silver during a time of a rapidly growing population. The emperor was well aware of this. But the tone of his letter is basically, a lot of it is posturing, that it would be unseemly for the Emperor of China to say glowing things about faraway England. And in an edict like this, which has primarily a domestic audience, he needs to show that he's not obsessed with foreign things. And I should say that this obsession with foreign things runs through the book as a debate amongst Chinese scholars about the value of foreign trade, because foreign products are very popular in urban China in the early 19th century, and a lot of money gets spent on them that certain scholars think is a waste of resources. And those who want to shut down foreign trade, it's largely because they see it as being wasteful. That money that should be staying in the country is being spent instead on fancy textiles or furs or special glass prisms and clocks and eventually opium that could perfectly well come from China itself.
So there are a lot of contemporary parallels, but the one that stuck out to me was this whole arc of the West souring on China. We go from Voltaire writing about how Confucian society is the world's most noble and a real counterexample to what he saw as the really depraved and amoral Catholic Church. But then we get writers in this era talking about the rotten corner of a globe ripe for the picking for British imperialism. So just over the past 3 years, this view among Chinese experts in the US has really shifted in sort of the same ways.
Yeah, and not just sort of the West's widely conceived, but really sort of the China experts. It's one thing for the general public to have a certain opinion shaped by newspapers and books and things like that. It's another thing for people who are engaged somehow with China and spend their lives learning about it and studying it. And there are some very important examples of this in the era leading up to the Opium War and in the Opium War itself. That the experts who, in times when public opinion maybe looks down a bit on China, they're the ones who rise to the occasion to say, this is a country we should be engaged with. This is a great civilization. This is a place that we should respect. This is a place that, in its system of laws is almost the equal of Europeans, far superior to the Indians, as they would say back then. That they see their job as being to sort of hold China up and educate the public about how to respect it properly. That when things start to go south, and especially when the government in China or an official in China or an emperor in China acts in a way that they haven't predicted, they can become very vicious critics. They can become disillusioned very quickly, and then they become sort of the point men in talking about the threat that China poses, or how terrible it is, or how it's going to fall apart. In this book, it was George Staunton who really played that role. But what you're saying about policy leaders in the past 3 or 4 years, yes, there's been a sea change in the China studies community in the United States, going from sort of preaching engagement and opening, and we need to be patient and accommodating of China's rise, to a real bitterness that's been creeping in, and a disillusionment, and sort of throwing hats on the ground and saying this isn't a government we can really work with. So yeah, these pendulums have swung, and it's especially to watch how the swing relates to specifically the people who stake their careers on China and on interpreting it.
Absolutely. So let's go back to the process by which over a couple of decades, tea goes from this rarefied product for the elite to a national staple, almost as important as something like salt or bread. So what's up with tea?
Tea is, it becomes Britain's national drink, and you get a little buzz of caffeine from it. It gives you a way of taking in more sugar, which is good for you. But the issue about the China trade, and the reason why the reason why the China trade matters for the British is because in this era, China is the only place in the world they can get tea. And specifically, Canton is the only place in China where they're allowed to buy it. They're not allowed to trade in other ports. Much of this is driven by tea. When Macartney went over on his mission, one of the hopes of the mission was that he would be able to bring back some tea plants and hopefully some actual tea farmers from China, so they could experiment with trying to cultivate tea in other British territories. That didn't work out. But as long as they were beholden to China for their tea, they wanted the trade to be open. And it's not just a matter of, as the newspapers like to put it, gladdening the breakfast tables of England, but the fact that the East India Company has a monopoly on the China trade, and the government in Great Britain taxes it very heavily for that privilege. So the tea that's imported to England from China at various times has 100% or more tax levied on it, which becomes a very substantial revenue stream for the British government, especially important during the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century. And so for that reason, indirectly, the British government has a vested interest in the stability and prosperity of the market at Canton, which is incidentally one of the reasons why they were so hands-off of it. Even Macartney in 1793 recognized that already the Royal Navy was powerful enough to bring China to its knees. That already the capabilities of the British Navy were so far superior to anything the Chinese had at the time, because China's power was on land, and especially these wars fought out in Central Asia. But as he wrote about it, he said it would be so easy to just send in a few gunships and force China to its knees. He said, but if we did that, then the emperor would just shut down our access to tea, and then where would we be left? It would be a terrible blow to our economy. So it was this fear of losing tea that really kept the government intent on maintaining stability in China.
Well, it's about high time we turn to drugs. So these merchants had a much more potent cargo than simply cotton. How did opium as a trade evolve, and how was it important to the UK, and what was, most importantly, its societal impact on China?
Yeah, I mean, the importance of opium for the UK was very, very indirect, that it ultimately became sort of a lubrication for the China market and a way of getting the tea, which was taxed, which was a direct, that was direct revenue for the British government. Opium itself, I mean, it had been around for a very long time. In terms of foreigners bringing it to China, there is a sequel to Robinson Crusoe set in 1719, where Robinson Crusoe has been rescued from his castaway island, and he's now shipping opium to Macau. The East India Company has this, I mean, it's this fascinatingly perverse relationship with the opium trade, which is that they discover they can grow and produce it easily in the territory that they control in India, but they are afraid of carrying it to China and trying to sell it because it's illegal there, even if there's bribery in every direction, and people are always calling it sort of de facto, sort of so-called illegal. But in any case, so what the East India Company settles on is they produce opium under a monopoly in their territories of India, which is not all of India, but in British India. And then they sell it at auction at Calcutta to private merchants, British, also Parsis from India, who then carry it to China and take the risk of finding a market for it in outside Canton, at the outlying islands, or up and down the coast. So by that means, the East India Company is going to make a huge amount of money from the sale of opium without actually carrying any of it to China by itself. And the East India Company merchants in Canton have absolutely nothing to do with this trade. That by the time the opium gets to China, it's in the hands of private merchants. The thing that happens, which makes opium into a serious problem, so initially coming into the 19th century, it's coming in limited supply. The East India Company has a vested interest in keeping it at a limited supply, which keeps the price very high. And the users of opium in China are wealthy people. It's an expensive foreign imported luxury good. So wealthy urbanites, people at court, people who work in government offices, they are the primary users of opium. And back to the sort of the whole foreign goods thing, they prefer this opium from India because it's a foreign good. It's like buying, like French champagne or something like that. But the best, the most expensive kind has the stamp of approval of the East India Company. What goes haywire in that system in the early 19th century is that agricultural producers in other parts of India outside of the control of the British realize that they can get in on this trade just as easily. And so they start producing large amounts of opium in the free states of India, which the British can't control. And that gets shipped out of Bombay and carried over to China as a rival kind of opium. They compete for market share. They compete on price. The price starts declining. And the East India Company just wildly overreacts. First, they try to corner the market by buying all of the opium from the free trading states, and then they just produce more. Finally, the East India Company throws up its hands and decides that they're going to produce as much as they possibly can to try to steal back market share. And the result of this, of course, is a flood of opium that by the 1820s and into the 1830s starts going over and glutting the market in China, which again brings down the price, allows usage to spread in China as this fashion for opium usage spreads downward to not just the extremely wealthy, but just the somewhat wealthy. It's important, though, to note that the way we tend to think about opium in China is how it existed in the 20th century. When you talked about a staple like bread, it wouldn't be that until the 20th century. And at that point, most of the opium was being produced in China itself, and it was incredibly cheap, and peasants could afford it, and people in all walks of life. At the time of the Opium War, it was still expensive. It was still a luxury good. Common people weren't able to use it except in very limited amounts. the two reasons why it was such a problem in the eyes of the government. One was that because it was a problem to the emperor because most of the people using it worked in government and they were taking bribes and buying opium with it. So he was tied up with official corruption, which was a huge problem at that time for the Qing dynasty.
Yeah, I mean there was a there was a great little anecdote you had in there of a senior official writing a alarmist letter talking about how aspiring scholars during their 3-day civil service examination would be going through withdrawal while at the same time, locked in their tiny rooms writing their 8-legged essays.
Yeah.
I could not imagine a worse environment in which to be to be trying to cut yourself off cold from something like this.
Yeah.
No surprise that some didn't make it out. But sorry, back to your second point.
Especially because the students, some of them took up smoking opium because they'd heard that it would sharpen their faculties and make them smarter. But
warning to all those college kids out there thinking about playing around with Adderall. It doesn't end well, folks.
It ends in war, is what happens.
Jesus.
So from the standpoint of the emperor, there's the visibility of opium because it's the elites in the capital and it's the members of the imperial family and its officials and their underlings who are heavily involved in the trafficking and in the smoking of opium, that it becomes very present as a problem. The other reason that why it becomes seen as a crisis is economic, which is that because the opium trade is illegal and it takes place along the coast and at outlying islands, it's not subject to the same rules that the normal trade at Canton was. And at Canton, the only silver that was allowed to be used in foreign trade was Spanish dollars. And I guess the reasoning was that they'd come from abroad, so it was okay to give them back to foreigners. Whereas the trade along the coast was largely, they were being paid with domestic Chinese silver, which was not supposed to go out of the country, and which was pouring into the hands of the opium merchants, who then were just sending it back to England to be boiled down into bullion, or melted down, I guess. But it caused this drain of silver from the country. And the jury is still out on how much of a role the opium trade actually played in the silver shortages that occurred in 1830s China, but there were silver shortages, whether because of the opium trade, whether because of a global slump because of revolutions in Latin America that shut down mines, whether because of hoarding by wealthy people who saw the value going up. But the shortage of silver meant that the currency system in China got completely out of whack. Which mattered mainly because peasants who conducted most of their lives in copper currency had to cough up a certain amount of silver when they paid their taxes annually. And as silver became more scarce in China, it became more and more expensive. And so effectively, the tax rates on peasants started skyrocketing, in some places doubling, for no apparent reason. And the government, after canvassing officials and trying to figure this out, ultimately concluded that the real problem here is the opium trade and the fact that so much silver is going out of the country because of that. And that's what sends Lin Zexu to Canton. That is what ultimately causes the war, was the silver issue in China.
It's an interesting interaction. You can do all the hard regressions you want on silver's impact on the Chinese economy, but even if in the actual fact of the economy, the causation wasn't opium that led to the change in silver prices, the fact that the senior officials perceived it as such was what drove their actions at the time.
Yeah, I mean, in Lin Zexu, the point man, the man who led the crackdown at Canton, the one who set his sights on the foreign opium dealers, the reason for the war breaking out. He's remembered as this uncompromising enemy of opium and upstanding, principled, moralist, and the wonderful thing about this is, just a fascinating detail about him is that the first thing that he actually goes on record saying about opium is in 1833, several years before the Opium War. By the time of the Opium War, he's a suppressionist. He wants to stamp out opium usage. 1833, he writes to the emperor that if the problem is that so much silver is going out of the country because of the opium trade with foreigners, then the best solution to that would be that the Chinese should grow more opium themselves, and then they would buy it from each other, and we wouldn't have silver going out of the country, and we wouldn't have an economic crisis. So that, of course, gets forgotten along the way about Lin Zexu.
So there's a lot of misunderstandings, cross-cultural and otherwise, that go on in this story. So let's start with the British. What did they miss about Chinese society?
At the time of the war itself, the biggest, most monstrous miss was that when Lin Zexu came and demanded that the British hand over their opium, and he sort of put the compound where the foreigners live under lock and key, those all of the merchants who had been in China for very long didn't expect anything really to come of this. Their trade might be shut down for a little while. It was frustrating, but they knew they weren't going to get their heads chopped off. They knew they weren't going to get stuck in some Chinese prison for the rest of their lives. So they really, they just sort of yawned and went, and decided to wait things out, which is what they had done in the past, wait for things to blow over. The huge miscalculation that makes this war possible is that this man named Charles Elliot, who is the British Superintendent of Trade, who's arrived fairly recently, he gets it into his head that this is a very literal threat, and that if the British subjects who he sees as being sort of under his protection, if they don't give up all of their opium, which is, it's far away on various ships that have been sent off to Singapore and Manila and stuff. It's not actually like there on the ground in Canton to hand over. It can't be seized by the Chinese authorities. Elliot gets it into his head that if they don't bring back all of their opium and give it to Lin Zexu, that they are going to get their heads chopped off. And he acts on the basis of that, and he writes reports back to Palmerston, so that the government in Britain thinks that these threats are legitimate, and therefore, that their countrymen are under threat of death in China, and that constitutes grounds for a war of reprisal. But really, the thing that makes the whole war ultimately possible is, it's Charles Elliot totally misreading the situation, finding a way to give all that opium to Lin Zexu, and the only way that he can do that, because he actually doesn't have any power over the British subjects at all. He really has no authority. So what he manages to do to get them to give up their opium is he buys it from them all in the name of Queen Victoria. He signs these promissory notes that they're going to be paid back by the British government for all of their property, and then collects it all and then hands it over, and Lin Zexu destroys it. And that, more than anything, is what tips the government into military action in the end, because they are then on the hook for £2 million worth of opium, which they owe to their own national drug dealers, and who have a legitimate claim in British courts to this payback. And the government just doesn't have that money to give them. And so ultimately, at this very fateful cabinet meeting, they decide that since they don't have the money to pay back these merchants, they'll make China pay them back, on the excuse that Lin Zexu is threatening them.
Yeah, it's cheaper to start a war than bail out Lehman or something. It's really one hell of a logical train that you see in this parliamentary debate, and these letters that Palmerston leaves us. Maybe we could talk a little bit about what you think the Chinese missed. One thing that sort of struck me was this inability to understand British politics, which I guess makes a lot of sense, because unlike the British, maybe they were off by 10 or 20%, but the Chinese, have no one in running around Europe writing books about what's going on, and hanging out in Westminster, understanding the intricacies of parliamentary debate. It's interesting, some of the parallels where today you hear the Chinese government, kind of complaining to Western democracies, why are we getting bad press? Why are your companies not doing things in line with your national policies? This kind of expectation that the foreign countries have the same type of power and influence over the entire society, from a commerce, from a media, from a cultural perspective, that the Chinese government does, was an interesting parallel between modern PRC and the Qing dynasty you were focusing on here.
Yeah, I'd say one miscalculation on the Chinese side was not understanding what free trade really meant. That Charles Elliot himself was quite opposed to the opium trade, but he had no power to do anything about it. He was just the superintendent. He didn't have any coercive power. Actually, the government of Britain tried to arrange for him to be able to establish legal courts over the British subjects in China, and that was shot down by Parliament because it infringed on China's sovereignty and China's jurisdiction. That the British could not just go setting up a law court in Chinese territory. That was unsound. So as the officials that he was in contact with in Canton pressed him to do something to restrict the opium traders, Elliot would just keep protesting, like, I don't have that power. And with free traders, the government doesn't have that power either. That we can't, that it's not illegal under British law for them to be doing this. We can't enforce your country's laws for them. So I mean, there were the loggerheads there where that he did ultimately find ways of cooperating, basically by by threatening to turn people over to the Chinese authorities. But I think the bigger issue here, and it's the imbalance of knowledge in the two different directions, which you brought up, that the early 19th century is a period where you have the British for the first time really seriously trying to learn the language of China, trying to learn how the government operates, various explorers and missionaries trying to get into the country to find out what life is actually like. Really just trying to understand this other empire as much as they can. Whereas there's nothing in the other direction. There's a few Chinese travelers who have gone off to Europe and left accounts. So there isn't the same understanding of sort of how the British government operates. There is, however, a very good understanding of how British merchants operate because they've been working with them for so long, for generations. And I think one of the heartbreaking things about all this is what the Chinese did not miss, which is that Lin Zexu, as he was on his way down to Canton, received advice from various scholars who understood the situation at Canton better than him. He'd never been there before. He didn't have any experience with foreigners. And the officials who had experience with foreigners, the scholars who were based in Canton, generally were the ones who were very wary of doing anything that would provoke or any kind of a violent military response from the British. And specifically, they were aware that shutting down trade could provoke a violent response. It had at times. In 1834, there was an incident where gunships were called in because trade was shut down. That de-escalated before anything serious happened, but not before those gunships blasted their way past China's very best coastal defenses with relative ease. So it isn't that the Chinese didn't realize what they were getting into. It's that various people warned Lin Zexu not to involve the British in his crackdown on opium, that he was supposed to do a domestic crackdown on domestic traffickers and users. And as people on both sides recognized, if the Chinese weren't buying opium, the British wouldn't be able to sell it. And there was nothing they could do about that. And there would be absolutely no grounds for reprisal on Britain's side. But what Lin Zexu did, and what he gets faulted for by his contemporaries, and by those who predicted outcomes like this ahead of time, is that he doesn't just try to confiscate the opium. He also shuts down all British trade of every kind, ultimately for 6 weeks, a period of time when nobody knows when it's going to end. And that is what other Chinese scholars had said that might provoke them to anger and bring us, a war that we can't win. And that's ultimately what happened. So it's not that the Chinese generally were ignorant or miscalculated. It was that Lin Zexu specifically didn't listen to advice from people who might have, where if he had taken their advice, things might have gone in a very different direction. And one more thing that I would add, in trading terms, that we tend to think of the commerce between Britain and China by this point as being entirely about opium. Opium was a major part of the commerce, but it was separate from the above-board commerce, selling textiles and things like that at Canton, which was also thriving at the time. When Lin Zexu shut down the entire trade with Canton, so not just for the opium merchants, but shiploads of British textiles were waiting offshore, unable to unload their goods, that played an even greater role in starting the war than just sort of the confiscation of opium. The confiscation of opium created a financial problem for the British government. The shutting down of the regular trade that brought into action the manufacturers back in England. In the manufacturing districts in England, cities like Manchester and Leeds and Bristol, they became involved in a way that they never would have been involved in an opium issue. They washed their hands of the opium trade. They thought it was disgraceful. They had nothing to do with it, but they viewed China as a major outlet for their products. So the merchants in Manchester alone sent a petition to Palmerston saying that year they were on track to, I don't have the number handy, but they were on track to sell something like 700,000 or 800,000 pounds worth of textiles to China, which would be unsellable as long as the trade was shut down. And so therefore they were pushing hard for the government in Great Britain to do something to reopen the normal trade, which brought in a huge political force. I mean, the political power of the manufacturing districts was magnitudes of order greater than that of these paltry opium traders going back and forth from India to China. And in financial terms, the fact that the textiles that were being sold just by Manchester were worth nearly half the value of all of the opium that had been seized and was destroyed also points to the fact that this wasn't just a trade in opium, that the British trade with China was much bigger than just that at the time. And that there were other possible courses of outcome that would have reduced and hopefully eventually done away with the opium side of the trade, while other products came in to fill the gaps.
There are fascinating contemporary echoes in that debate, whether to work on the supply or demand side, just go for legalization, or kill every opium user in China, sort of a la the Philippines model we're seeing today.
Yeah, be happy with what you have. I mean, also, the British, they go and fight this disgraceful and horrible and immoral war, and they don't really get much from it. I mean, all of these wars against China to open up ports and these visions of how rich everyone is going to get, they never really materialize. The firms, they never start making the money that they're expecting to get from sending in the gunships.
So coming back now to corruption in the Opium War, could you talk us through the impact that corrupt officials had in facilitating the trade?
Yeah, this was a period of terrible official corruption, which is sort of a legacy from the 18th century and the huge rise of the doubling of the Chinese population, whereas the government had to remain relatively small comparatively, making it harder and harder and harder to become an official, leading to all kinds of bribery schemes to get positions, and basically in debt. You have to make a yearly payment to the person who gave you your job. So yeah, corruption was endemic. And the opium issue weaves directly into that because it's a fantastic means of income for corrupt officials. They're easily bribed to ignore any laws having to do with opium smoking or opium smuggling. There's very, very few instances of the government actually successfully cracking down on opium prior to the Opium War. That there would be sort of these half-hearted attempts. Various instances that are trumpeted as great successes would turn out to actually have only confiscated a tiny amount of the drug. But the paralysis that set in around this was, it began with the Jiaqing emperor after Qianlong. With his punishment of He Shen, the most corrupt minister in all of Chinese history, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, I don't know. Have you seen the little thing going around the internet with the New York Times op-ed penned by He Shen saying that he's part of the resistance in the Qianlong administration?
I saw the one that said that if you wanted to see real court intrigue, you shouldn't waste your time with books like Bob Woodward's, but just read Qing Dynasty history. How rotten exactly was the Chinese bureaucracy at the time?
All just to say, so the emperor was faced with a bureaucracy that was corrupt at all levels. And where the people that the ministers who could be really properly trusted were few and far between. And it's a question of whether he should pursue an anti-corruption campaign, which, as he worried, would either lead to the destruction of the entire government because everybody is complicit, or it would just lead to a settling of scores as people turned in others because nobody was really nobody was really immune to it. Nobody was not part of it in some way. This matters with the discussions of opium policy because those who propose laws that target users of opium sort of the regular smokers of it, or low-level traffickers and couriers. That some will propose harsh punishments for people like that. And then other government ministers argue that if we do have laws like that, that's just going to become another means for those local officials to oppress the people under them. That by threat of enforcing these laws, they're going to force even people who don't have anything to do with opium to give them even more bribes. The bribery was rampant to the point that somebody like William Jardine, who's sort of the kingpin on the British side of the opium trade, this Scottish drug lord, could write to a friend back home that the opium trade in China is the most gentlemanlike speculation he's ever known, because he was very polite, because there was no enforcement of the laws at all. And so for the foreigners who were were in contact with the Chinese criminal guilds and merchants who were buying and selling their opium within China, it was a very sort of friendly process. We don't have examples of terrible violence going on or people being cheated or whatnot. It was just all of the officials had been bribed, and so the opium was going to go where it was going to go. And I should say that Britain, which is on the most extremely thin ice in trying to prosecute this war against China, one of the little threads that Palmerston holds on to in trying to justify why the British can go to war over these drug traffickers who have been breaking the law for so long, and he writes about this in a letter to the emperor. He said that because this law has basically been a dead letter all along, that you've never punished foreigners for selling opium in China. Up until the Opium War, the worst that a foreigner could possibly fear if they were caught doing anything short of murdering a Chinese person would be to get kicked out of the country and told not to come back. So all of a sudden, Lin Zexu came to Canton saying that foreigners could be executed for selling opium. And in the eyes of Palmerston, that constituted an atrocity because those laws had never been enforced before. And then to suddenly sweep in and enforce them was something that was unreasonable and irrational, and therefore Britain and China needed a proper treaty stating the rights of the British in China. And that's how the war happens.
Well, I guess we do have tree-lined streets in Shanghai to thank for this, but aside from that, for sure, it's interesting how small the return ends up really being, given all the effort that went into it. I really want to now turn to some of your characters, which I think is, a real fun part of the book. And it was clear that you really enjoyed engaging with these people and kind of following them on their China stories. While you don't have anyone who thinks they're Jesus's son along the lines of, at the same time, there are certainly some characters ranging from a Brit who shows up and hangs out with the Dalai Lama, a la that Brad Pitt movie. We have really nerdy China scholars who end up playing huge roles in international politics. We have a single American hanging out in Canton, who's the belle of the sweaty Southern Chinese ball. There's just so much color in a book that's nominally about this high diplomatic relationship. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about some of your favorites and the types of sources you were able to draw from, and maybe some tales from the archives of finding out about these rather Shaojian figures from history.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up Thomas Manning, the one who goes and meets with the Dalai Lama. He almost didn't make it into the book because it took me a while to figure out why he was necessary, because he's wonderful in and of himself. He's this fascinating, eccentric character who grows his beard down to his waist and manages to sneak himself into Tibet and goes and meets with the Dalai Lama. So he does represent more than just himself. But there, in terms of tracking his story, you wanted stories from the archives. I had actually already written the chapter that he first appeared in. I'd written a draft of it based on these really fragmentary sources that are available about him. Like, very little is known about him. He never really published anything. He was viewed as this big scholar back in Britain, but he never published anything at all. It was sort of part of his eccentricity. But pretty soon after that, I found out that the Royal Asiatic Society in London had just discovered this trove of Thomas Manning's personal papers that had been just gathering dust in the proverbial antiquarian bookstore. But they had discovered these and they found them, and they had just they'd just gone through and cataloged them. And so I was able to go and look at his original diaries from when he went up to Tibet, and look at his letters home to his father and whatnot. Just there's this wonderful confluence that happens when you have a character that you're interested in, who you hope can have a role in the book, and then you do manage to find sources that allow you to really work with them. Because sometimes you can't, and sometimes you can't make a character work, and they have to just be a one-dimensional person who pops in and then disappears, even if they play a major role. Incidentally, that was a big issue with my Taiping book. One thing that I don't think anyone has ever noticed, or at least nobody has ever told me that they noticed, that the two biggest characters in my Taiping book are Zheng Guofan on one hand, the Hunan general, and Hong Rengan, the prime minister of the Taipings, who's really the character that the whole book hangs on. Like, he's the beginning to end narrative. It's the story of Hong Rengan. So the dirty secret from that book, I guess not so secret if you look at the notes, is that I was working with two main characters, one of whom, Zheng Guofan, you have just volumes and volumes of paper about him. They just republished a new edition of his collected works, which was, I don't know, 16 or 17 volumes, all of his letters home to his sons, all of his diaries, new versions of his diaries that had been expurgated in the past. You can just go through day by day through his life and see what he's thinking, see, what kind of tea he's drinking and how many games of Go he plays with his underlings, all of that detail to work with. For Hong Rengan, the prime minister of the Taiping, I had a small number of propaganda pamphlets that he put together, but for actual detail on his life, all I had was 3 or 4 confessions that he wrote before he was executed, altogether totaling maybe 10 to 15 pages in Chinese. And so you put these on the scale, and how can you make it work out? And that was one of the challenges of writing it, was how to make both of these characters equally vivid when you have so much to work with for one and so little to work with for another. And it's a matter of pacing and bringing them in and out and making the most of what you actually have. So that was fun with Manning. Other characters, the nerdy China scholar you're referring to is probably George Staunton. Is that who you were thinking of? Yeah. George Thomas Staunton, this sort of sad sack, repressed, wallflower of a man. He's a fascinating character in and of himself, and although he's not the main character of this book, he's the only character who lives from beginning to end, and who matters from beginning to end. He's there all the way back at the time of the McCartney mission. He's along as a boy his father is the secretary to McCartney on that mission, and he's McCartney's page. And so as a little boy, he gets to go to Beijing, and he gets to sort of kneel in front of the Qianlong emperor, and he manages to be the only person on that entire embassy. Of everyone who came along with McCartney, he's the only one who learns any Chinese. And so he sort of trots out a few phrases and pleases the Qianlong emperor. But that sets in course his whole life. He winds up working for the East India Company. He becomes Britain's first real China scholar. The thing is, though, he's totally uncompelling as a character. He's sort of a heartbreaking figure. He's a horrible public speaker. He's very, very nervous. He doesn't really get along very well with other people. He doesn't seem to have very many friends. He's not what you would see as a hero figure. But in the era running up to the Opium War, he almost emerges as a sort of a heroic figure. By that point, he's back in England. He's got a seat in Parliament. During the debates over removing the monopoly of the East India Company, he is the one who predicts that doing away with the East India Company monopoly and letting in any Tom, Dick, or Harry with a ship into the China trade is going to lead to conflict and possibly even war. He's the one who says that. He's the one who knows it. He gets up in Parliament to make a speech about it, and he is such a horribly bad public speaker that nobody can understand what he's saying, and people just walk out, and eventually they cut off his speech because there is only about 40 people left in the entire chamber. So that's poor Staunton. And then I must say that even then he still sort of maintains sort of this voice of conscience towards China, and that he just breaks your heart in two at the end of the book when you get to the actual Opium War. And he does exactly what he's not supposed to. and that's all there is to him.
You know, given that this is the only chance I get to shout out Napoleon on China Econ Talk, I think I'd be remiss to giving up this opportunity. There's a quote that Napoleon gave at the very end of his life when he was cooped up in St. Helena to someone who was dropping by from his way on his way from China back to the UK, saying, "The worst thing you could have done for a number of years would be to go to war with an immense empire like China. You would doubtless first succeed, but you would teach them their own strength, and in the course of time, they would defeat you." You know, this whole idea of the dragon awakening is certainly bearing out today in Xi's China, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, that resentment he warns his British doctor about provoking in the Chinese is absolutely something we are still feeling today. I mean, the memory of the Opium War is just foundational to Chinese nationalism. And as we see the expansion of the Chinese Navy in the South China Sea, behind that is sort of promise like we will never be bullied the way we were then. Thank you
Platt,
so much.
So much.
It's been really enjoyable, Jordan.
If you're looking for more SupChina powered podcast action, this week I'd recommend you check out TechBuzz China's hot take on the tech-enabled rental agencies in Beijing.
China Econ Talk is edited by Jason McRonald and Kaiser Guo and is a proud member of the Sinica Network from SupChina. For other great shows on China, check out the Caixin Sinica Business Brief, the Pan Daily Tech Buzz China, the New Voices Podcast, and of course, the Sinica Podcast, now in its 9th year. Until next week.